Hi there, this is Solid Ronan from Solid Ronan Films, and welcome to another random review. And today's random review is of David Mamet's The Spanish Prisoner from 1997. One of the reasons for doing this random review is pretty much to say it finally got a Blu-ray release. It just came out a few weeks ago. I got this on Amazon.com, but it is actually a multi-region, which is good news for people in Region A and Region B only players. So it is multi-region. It's a good solid print, and unfortunately the only extra is the trailer. Now this is going to be a fairly short review for people who haven't seen it, because I'm just going to talk about the first 50 minutes of the film, and then I'm going to go into spoilers, because it is quite a spoiler heavy film. So hopefully the first part of this video will make you go out and buy the nice new Blu-ray release, and then you can come back and tell me what you thought of the film. So this is from 1997. I actually saw this on the big screen before I pretty much stopped going to the cinema. And being a Mamet fan already, this is a delightful little confection. This isn't as serious as his earlier work. This is pretty much his first kind of lighter film, and not really about, big issues. You could argue things change with Joe Mantegna and Don Amici, which we're still waiting for a Blu-ray release, because that really deserves one. You could argue that's a light comedy as well, but there's a kind of melancholy to that, and it has kind of more of a emotional heft just because it's Don Amici and Joe Mantegna. The Spanish Prisoner stars Campbell Scott and Steve Martin in a straight role, and bizarrely on the Blu-ray it says Felicity Huffman, who's only in it briefly as an FBI agent, whereas Rebecca Pigeon, who became David Mamet's wife, has a much larger role, but for some reason she's not actually on the front. It's maybe because Felicity Huffman is now bigger than Rebecca Pigeon, but at the time Felicity Huffman was obviously just starting out. If you're familiar with Mamet films, it has a bunch of his familiar faces, and for eagle-eyed viewers it has the actor who plays Clay Davis in The Wire as a traffic cop. Unfortunately, he doesn't say "she" at any point. Maybe in the outtakes, I don't know. Also stars Ricky Jay, who again, if you're familiar with Mamet, you'll be familiar with the wonderful Ricky Jay. And the basic setup is about Campbell Scott, who works for a company, and he has invented this process which is going to make the company lots of money. The owner of the company is Ben Gazzara, who has a wonderful turn in this film. Really good performance. And they go down to the islands. Gazzara, Ricky Jay, Campbell Scott, and Rebecca Pigeon, who's just new to the company as the secretary. Pretty much to tell the investors how much money they're going to make. And while they're down there in the islands, Campbell Scott meets Steve Martin, who asks him for a favour, in which he does the favour, and then they say maybe they'll meet up in New York. So as there's a kind of underlying story of Campbell Scott keeps asking Ben Gazzara when is he going to be rewarded for inventing this process. The great thing about the film is the process is essentially just a MacGuffin. We don't learn what the process is. All we need to know is it's going to make the company lots of money and their competitors would want it. That's pretty much all we need to know. So he's kind of got a slightly antagonist relationship going on with the company because he wants to get paid, and they're kind of, Ben Gazzara keeps saying, oh, we'll wait for the stockholders meeting, and as this goes on, he develops this friendship with Steve Martin, who is constantly mentioning his sister, and he keeps arranging for Campbell Scott to meet his sister, but she never turns up due to one reason or another. And as his relationship with Ben Gazzara kind of fractures, Steve Martin almost predicts what's going to happen. And then the company want to change the contract that he's under, and he gets more and more suspicious. So he asks Steve Martin for advice, and Steve Martin he suggests he maybe speak to his lawyer friend. So Campbell Scott wants to arrange this and have Steve Martin help him out. And again, this is a film that has the usual David Mamet themes, if you're familiar with his work, of identity and things not necessarily being what they seem, and the kind of projections we make onto other people about who we are, how smart we are, how rich we are, how attractive we are. So again, it's a film about identity. Again, this is a lighter film. People, I guess if you're being cynical, could argue this is kind of the PG version of House of Games. But for me, it's 110 minutes long, and certainly for me watching it, it just whizzes by. It's an absolute delight. Everybody's on top form. It has your usual wonderful Mamet snappy dialogue, which in the real world might not actually make too much sense, but in the Mamet world they're wonderful. So at this point, that's kind of the first half of the film, and this is where I'm going to go into spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film, please stop this video, go buy the shiny new Blu-ray, and come back to me and tell me what you thought of the film, or just watch the second half of this video. So I'm going to talk about spoilers about now. So if you're still here, you've seen the film, or maybe you just don't care to see the film and you just want to hear about what the spoilers are. So slowly Steve Martin's story starts to fall apart, and more and more he appears to be not who he says he is. So Campbell Scott goes to the FBI, and they tell him that Steve Martin's character is a known felon and a con artist. So they arrange for Campbell Scott, who's arranged with Steve Martin, to hand over the process, to show the lawyer his contract and the process while you're there. So the FBI arrange for them to have a meet and to try and get to Steve Martin to threaten him or try and bribe him for the process. So this meeting goes down, but Steve Martin doesn't turn up. So Campbell Scott tries to contact the FBI, but it turns out that Felicity Huffman's FBI agent perhaps isn't actually an FBI agent, because the real FBI agent whose name she's using is actually a man. And then Campbell Scott looks at the copy of the process and it's completely blank. So the process has been stolen, and he gets brought in by the police. There's lots of damning evidence pointing to Campbell Scott. One of the ruses are when they go out for a meal, Steve Martin makes him a member of this club, but it's actually a form for extradition to Venezuela, because it doesn't actually have extradition powers to the US. So it's actually claiming asylum in Venezuela, but obviously when he signs it, he thinks he's signing a club membership. And it is fantastic when the cop goes, are you planning a trip to Venezuela? The other thing is, during one of their meetings, Steve Martin is playfully asking him, whether you have a Swiss bank account, and he quickly sets him up with a Swiss bank account and puts like 15 Swiss francs in it. But at that time, Swiss law states that nobody can actually find out what you've got in a Swiss bank account. So again, the police are asking him, oh, you now seem to have a Swiss bank account. So all the fingers are pointing to Campbell Scott selling the process. Ricky Jay, the one friend that he has, turns up dead, and again he's stabbed with Campbell Scott's knife that we've seen before. So again, he's on the run for that. So he goes to Rebecca Pigeon for help, and she tries to get him back to the islands because they figure the videotape would have Steve Martin's image, because the police don't believe that Steve Martin's character actually exists. And it turns out that Rebecca Pigeon's character is in on it as well. So it's just fantastic how the FBI are fake, Steve Martin's fake, Rebecca Pigeon's fake. So it goes through all these levels of people that are trying to help him, and then they turn out to be the people that actually screwed him over. There's constant mentions of him being a Boy Scout and being too nice, and being an easy mark. And obviously Ben Gazzara wants his process back, and because all points are pointing to Campbell Scott selling it to competitors and then murdering his friend. And then eventually Campbell Scott figures out Rebecca Pigeon, and then it all ends up on a ferry going back to Boston, because again they try and get him caught at the airport. Rebecca Pigeon puts a gun in a pouch instead of a camera, and you can see it on X-ray. And then Steve Martin is on the ferry as well, and they are trying to kill Campbell Scott. And obviously it turns out that it's Ben Gazzara who actually set this whole thing up, because he wanted to steal the process for himself to sell and make even more money, which is the one part of the film where you think, well, he owns it anyway, so he would have made money, but obviously he would make more money. But considering he and Campbell Scott have the only two keys, then obviously he couldn't just steal it himself, so he had to hire these people to frame Campbell Scott And the kind of one of the jokes in it is the fact that the US Marshals that actually bring Steve Martin to justice are two Japanese people posing as tourists, because as one of the cops says, nobody suspects a Japanese tourist. And Steve Martin's tranquilised at the end of the film and arrested, and Rebecca Pigeon is arrested, and she kind of throws herself on Campbell Scott's mercy and asks him to help her, and he just says, which is just a great last line, he just says that she needs to spend some time in her room, and even Rebecca Pigeon has a wry smile on her face as she's bundled into the paddy wagon. So again, it's another wonderful Mamet kind of Chinese puzzle, as far as nobody is who they actually seem to be. Again, you could argue it's the PG version of House of Games. It's not as great as House of Games, it's not as bitter is maybe not the right word, but maybe not as cynical as House of Games. It kind of ends with a slightly happier ending than House of Games does, depending on your viewpoint, of course. But it's just an absolute treat. Again, it's not about anything big and serious, unlike, say, Oleana or Homicide. But it's just a lovely little caper film. Again, everybody's excellent. Steve Martin does a really nice turn in a serious role, which at the time I don't think he'd done too many. This was 1997. It's hard to believe it's 22 years ago. So I don't think he'd done too many serious things at that time. So I remember, in the reviews, it being a bit of a revelation that Steve Martin plays it straight. Ricky Jay's fantastic. Ben Gazzara's fantastic. Ed O'Neill turns up as one of the fake FBI agents. Yes, it's convoluted. Yes, it's contrived. But it's an absolute treat. And I would highly recommend it. Obviously, if you're watching this and you've watched it all the way through, then I hope you've watched it. And if you haven't, I would still watch it, because you'll forget what I've said fairly quickly once you start watching the film. And again, it's a film that you can watch on repeated viewings, because you can see the little details in the first 45-50 minutes that then are called back as the story unravels and the layers of deception unravel. You can kind of see that wee bit and that wee bit and that wee bit. Yes, you could argue that this is the last really good, very good Mamet film that he's written and directed. You could argue the films after this weren't as good as the first half of his directorial career, and I think that's a fair point. But this is an absolute treat. So thank you very much for watching. Please let me know if you've seen The Spanish Prisoner and what you thought of it, and please let me know if you are planning to purchase this lovely little Blu-ray, because it's about time it got a Blu-ray release. And like I said, hopefully things change, will follow suit, even though I've got a feeling that's owned by Paramount, so Paramount don't seem to want to release Blu-rays, I don't know why. So thanks very much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again for another random review. This is Solitude Ronan saying thanks for watching, and farewell.